Imagine a weapon that strikes from the edge of space, faster than the speed of sound. It gives no warning. The first sign of its arrival is the deafening silence after the explosion has already happened. In 1944, this wasn't science fiction. It was a terrifying new reality for London, and the Allies had no defense against it. Today, I'm going to tell you the secret story of Operation Crossbow, the desperate Allied hunt for Hitler's vengeance weapons. We'll uncover how the Germans ran a brilliant deception game with fake, dummy targets that made fools of Allied intelligence, leading to costly and brutal mistakes. You'll witness the story of the engineer who designed a man-made earthquake to slay concrete monsters deemed indestructible. And stick around to the end for the most shocking secret of all, how the Nazi architect of this terror campaign escaped justice and was given a new identity to build a machine that would change the future of humanity forever. This is a story of terror, ingenuity, and a paradox that defines our modern age. If you enjoy these deep dives into military history, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button to help the channel. Now, let's begin. The year 1943 began not with a bang, but with the chilling silence of a dream turning sour. For the Third Reich, the intoxicating rush of early victories had evaporated, leaving behind the bitter taste of reality. The name Stalingrad was no longer a point on a map, it was a wound, a festering, gangrenous wound on the psyche of the regime, a name whispered in the same breath as defeat. On the endless frozen plains of the Eastern Front, an entire army had been swallowed whole, and the tide of the war, once an unstoppable German flood, had begun to recede. Back home, the nights were no longer peaceful. The constant droning hum of Allied bombers had become a nightly symphony of destruction, turning proud cities into landscapes of dust and memory. The promise of a 1,000-year reign now seemed like a cruel joke told in a graveyard. It was in this crucible of fear and failure that a new idea began to take root, an idea born not of sound military strategy, but of pure, unadulterated emotion. In the smoke-choked chambers of the wolf's lair, logic had long since been replaced by something far more potent and far more dangerous: desperation. The Führer, and those who still clung to his vision, needed more than just a new tank or a faster airplane. They needed a miracle. They needed a weapon that could leapfrog the battlefield, bypass the armies and navies, and strike directly at the heart of the enemy. A weapon not just for winning the war, but for punishing those who dared to resist. They called it Vergeltungswaffen, the vengeance weapons. Far from the collapsing fronts and the political machinations, on a quiet, windswept island in the Baltic Sea, that vengeance was taking shape. Peenemünde was less a military base and more a secret city, a sprawling complex of laboratories, wind tunnels, and colossal assembly halls, all dedicated to a single audacious goal: to conquer the sky itself. Here, brilliant minds, led by the charismatic and fiercely ambitious Werner von Braun, worked with a fervor that bordered on religious. They were engineers and physicists, men who dreamed of reaching the stars, yet their genius was now shackled to a far darker purpose. The wind off the Baltic whispered of the future, of spaceflight and exploration, but the blueprints on their tables detailed machines of unprecedented terror. Two distinct nightmares were being engineered in this isolated kingdom. The first was the Fieseler F-103, a crude, pulse-jet-powered terror that would soon be known as the V-1 flying bomb. It was a pilotless aircraft, little more than a ton of high explosives with wings with a sputtering engine that sounded, unsettlingly, like a motorcycle in the sky. It was cheap, easy to produce, and designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers, a swarm of mechanical locusts to sow panic and chaos. But the second creation, the Aggregate 4, or A4, was something else entirely. This was the true jewel of Peenemünde, the culmination of years of research. It was a 14-ton, 46-foot-tall behemoth, a true ballistic missile capable of rising 50 miles to the edge of space before plunging down on its target faster than the speed of sound. The V2 was not just a weapon, it was a technological prophecy. Unlike the V1, it gave no warning. Its arrival would be announced only by the sudden, deafening cataclysm of its impact. It was silent, unstoppable, and represented a quantum leap in the art of warfare. It was the stuff of science fiction made terrifyingly real, and it consumed steel, fuel, and the most skilled labor in the Reich at a prodigious rate. This was the ultimate gamble, a weapon that could win the war or bleed Germany dry in the process. It began, as these things often do, not in a general's briefing room, but as a scrap of paper on a cluttered desk in London. Then another and another. They were whispers carried on the wind of espionage, fragments of a puzzle smuggled out of occupied France. The reports were disjointed, confusing. A farmer in Normandy saw German engineers pouring concrete into the ground day and night. For what purpose, he did not know. A message from a resistance cell, written in code on the back of a ration ticket, spoke of massive, oddly shaped buildings that seemed to have no windows and pointed, unnervingly, straight towards England. At first, these were dismissed, just more pieces of the sprawling Atlantic Wall, perhaps new fortifications or hidden depots. There was a war on. The Germans were always building something. But the whispers persisted, growing more specific, more urgent. They spoke of a feverish, almost frantic pace of construction, of sites heavily guarded and shrouded in a level of secrecy that was unusual even for the occupiers. The job of making sense of this noise fell to the men and women of Allied intelligence. In the quiet, focused intensity of RAF Medmenham, a sprawling country house repurposed for the grim business of photo interpretation, the war was a silent, two-dimensional affair fought with stereoscopes and magnifying glasses. Here, the whispers from the ground met the hard evidence from the sky. Brave pilots in unarmed, high-speed Spitfires and Mosquitoes would streak across the channel, their cameras capturing millions of acres of hostile territory in a matter of minutes. These photographs were the raw, unfiltered truth, and somewhere in their millions of silver halide crystals lay the secrets Germany was trying to keep. The analysts hunched over light tables for hours on end until the fields and forests of France swam before their eyes, began to notice a pattern. The strange sights the resistance mentioned were real, and there were dozens of them. They didn't look like gun emplacements, they weren't U-boat pens. They followed a specific, repeating layout. A handful of nondescript buildings, one of which was always unusually long, and a peculiar concrete structure. And then one analyst, a sharp-eyed woman named Constance Babington Smith, saw the key. A detail so strange, so out of place, that it demanded a second and then a third look. A ramp. Long, slightly curved, and shaped, for all the world, like a ski. It was this bizarre feature that gave the installations their first codename, ski sites. What could they be? Theories flew around Medmenham. Launchers for new, oversized gliders? Some kind of catapult for assisting heavy bombers? The pieces didn't fit. The structures were too small for large aircraft, yet too elaborate for simple artillery. The mystery deepened until someone connected these new sites in France to that other great enigma, the strange facility at Peenemünde. The Peenemünde file was a puzzle box of its own, but one grainy enlargement showed something small and winged sitting on a similar, though more primitive ramp. Suddenly, it wasn't just a collection of oddities anymore. It was a system, a network. The long buildings were for assembly and storage. The ski-shaped ramps were for launching. And the small winged object from the Baltic coast was the projectile. The whispers from across the channel had coalesced into a single, terrifying realization. London was the target. The file that landed on the desk of Duncan Sandys in the summer of 1943 did not feel like paper and ink. It felt like a ticking clock. Churchill's son-in-law, a man tasked by the Prime Minister with peering into the scientific future of the war, now held the first grainy photographs of a nightmare. The Medmenham report, with its meticulous analysis and terrifying conclusions, was no longer a theoretical puzzle for analysts to solve. It was a formal declaration of a new kind of war, aimed not at armies, but at the very morale of the British people. The evidence was undeniable. A network of strange, purpose-built sites multiplying like a cancer across the coastline of northern France. And terrifying. What remained was the monumental task of convincing a government, already strained to the breaking point, that this threat was real, immediate, and worthy of a massive diversion of resources. But in the hollowed, cigar-scented air of the cabinet war rooms, evidence was rarely enough. It had to survive the onslaught of opinion, of skepticism, of scientific orthodoxy. The primary voice of doubt belonged to Lord Cherwell, Churchill's powerful and deeply trusted scientific advisor. Cherwell, a brilliant physicist, looked at the data on the proposed German rocket and found it wanting. The physics, he argued, were simply not there. To build a large, liquid-fueled rocket capable of crossing the channel with a 1-ton warhead was a feat of engineering so immense, so astronomically expensive and unreliable that it bordered on fantasy. It was, he suggested, more likely an elaborate German hoax, a clever piece of deception designed to make the Allies waste millions of gallons of fuel and thousands of bombs on empty fields and fake concrete ramps, diverting them from the real fight. The debate raged in the underground fortress beneath Whitehall. On one side, Sandys presented the stark, visual proof from the Spitfire's cameras. On the other, Cherwell countered with calculations and scientific precedent. The Prime Minister listened, his bulldog features set in a familiar scowl of intense concentration. He puffed on his cigar, the smoke curling around him as he weighed the arguments. He respected Cherwell's mind, but he also possessed a deep, almost instinctual understanding of his enemy's psyche. He knew the Nazi regime's penchant for the grandiose, for the miracle weapon. More importantly, he understood that a weapon didn't have to be perfectly efficient to be devastating. It only had to create terror. With the Allied invasion of Europe looming on the horizon, the one thing he could not afford was a panicked, demoralized London. With a nod and a guttural command, the decision was made. The risk of inaction was too great. The threat, fantastic or not, would be met with overwhelming force. The jumble of intelligence reports, reconnaissance photos, and conflicting scientific opinions was given a name, a simple, elegant, and deeply menacing code name that captured the essence of the fight to come: Operation Crossbow. This was to be no mere series of bombing raids. It was a formal, top-priority campaign, a dedicated crusade with its own committee, its own intelligence apparatus, and a direct line to the Prime Minister himself. The directive was sent down to the RAF's Bomber Command and the newly arrived U.S. 8th Air Force. The mission was clear: find every one of these ski sites, these supply depots, these massive, hardened bunkers. Understand them, and then erase them from the face of the earth. The crossbow was drawn. Its target was not a single point on a map, but an entire network of hidden terror. Across the airfields of England, the low growl of bomber engines began to sound a new, urgent note. The hunt had begun. The hunt did not begin with the roar of 1,000 bombers, but with the solitary hum of a single Merlin engine climbing through the pre-dawn chill over the fields of Kent. Before the strategists could draw lines on a map, before the bomb aimers could peer through their Norden sights, one man had to go first, alone. He had to fly into the heart of the enemy's domain, not to fight, but simply to look. This was the lonely, nerve-shredding business of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, the men who formed the literal tip of Crossbow Spear. They were a unique breed, these pilots. They were lone wolves in a war of wolf packs, their currency not enemy aircraft destroyed, but feet of exposed film returned safely to base. Their steeds were not war horses, but racers, stripped of every ounce of unnecessary weight.
The PRU Spitfires and Mosquitoes they flew were marvels of modification, painted a distinct, ethereal shade of PRU blue, designed to render them nearly invisible against the high-altitude sky. Gone were the machine guns and cannons, their bays now filled with the intricate machinery of high-altitude cameras like the F-52. Gone was the heavy armor plating. Their only defense was altitude, their only weapon, speed.
A mission began with a simple briefing, a set of coordinates, a target box drawn on a map of France, and a weather forecast that was, more often than not, a work of optimistic fiction. The pilot would climb and keep climbing, pushing his supercharged engine until the world fell away into a curved blue and green map below, settling at an altitude of 30,000 feet where the air was thin and brutally cold. This serene, godlike vantage point was a complete illusion. Every moment over occupied territory was a gamble. The sky was a shooting gallery. The pilot had to thread a needle through known flak concentrations, his eyes constantly scanning the vast emptiness for the one thing he truly feared, the glint of sunlight off the canopy of a Luftwaffe fighter. If spotted by an FW-190, there would be no dogfight, no heroic turning battle. There was only the desperate full-throttle dive for home, a race he might not win. The most critical moment of any sortie was the photo run itself. This was the heart of the gamble. As he approached the target, a suspected ski site, a nondescript patch of forest hiding a concrete bunker, every instinct screamed to brake, to dive, to evade the angry black puffs of flak that blossomed in the thin air around him. But he couldn't. For the cameras to work their magic, he had to hold the plane perfectly straight and level, a stable platform for the unblinking eye in the fuselage behind him. For those few agonizing minutes, as the cameras whirred mechanically, he was the most vulnerable man in the sky. It was an act of supreme discipline, a triumph of mission over self-preservation. Only when the film wound to a stop could he bank hard, push the nose down, and become a blue speck fleeing for the safety of the channel. Each mission was a roll of the dice, but without these pilots and the precious, incredibly detailed images they brought back, Operation Crossbow would have been blind. Every bomb that fell, every strategic decision made in the war rooms began here, with one man in an unarmed plane, risking everything for a picture. The photographs told the generals where. Now the heavy bombers would provide the how. With the crossbow targets identified and plotted on maps, the operational phase of the hunt began, and it would be a relentless, around-the-clock assault driven by two radically different philosophies of air warfare. It was a story of two air forces, the American 8th and the British Royal Air Force, attacking the same enemy with opposing strategies, each a product of their unique experiences and national doctrines. The Americans brought a scalpel, the British a sledgehammer. The American effort was a creature of the day. It was a war fought in the brutal, unfiltered light, founded on an almost religious faith in technology and precision. For the young crews of the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, a mission began in the cold English morning, the air thick with the smell of high-octane fuel. They flew in massive, carefully ordered formations, the famed combat boxes, creating a rolling hedgehog of defensive machine gun fire. It was a world of biting cold that froze condensation on the inside of plexiglass turrets, and of a sky so brilliantly blue it felt like an insult. Their article of faith was the Norden bomb sight, a complex mechanical computer that, in theory, could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 5 miles up. To the USAAF command, bombing was a science, a form of aerial surgery. The target, a single concrete ramp, a specific nondescript building in a French forest, was to be excised with minimal collateral damage. But this precision came at a staggering cost. Daylight made them a perfect target for the Luftwaffe's fighters, who would swarm them in head-on attacks, and for the brutally accurate German flak batteries on the ground, whose black bursts of death would walk through the bomber formations with chilling accuracy. When the sun set and the last American contrails evaporated from the stratosphere, a different kind of war began.
For the crews of RAF Bomber Command, the enemy was the darkness itself. Their strategy was born from the brutal losses of early war daylight raids. They would use the night as a cloak, sending their heavy bombers, primarily the magnificent Avro Lancaster, a plane that was essentially a cavernous bomb bay with wings, one by one in a long, loosely organized bomber stream. Their world was a cramped, vibrating bubble of aluminum and perspex hurtling through an infinite void, punctuated by the sudden, terrifying geometry of searchlight beams. Fear was a constant companion, but it was a different kind of fear. It was the dread of the unseen enemy, the German night fighter stalking them with its radar, the sudden, violent explosion of a direct flak hit from a gun they never saw, or the horrifying scrape of metal on metal that signaled a mid-air collision with another friendly bomber lost in the same patch of darkness. Their targets were marked not by sight, but by the cascades of colored flares dropped by the elite Pathfinder crews. Their goal was less surgical precision and more total annihilation of a target area. By day, the Americans brought their science. By night, the British brought their righteous fury. The attacks were relentless, a 24-hour cycle of destruction aimed at tearing out the heart of the V-weapon program before it could beat. But on the ground in France, amidst the cratered earth and splintered wood, the Germans were proving maddeningly resilient. The question hanging in the briefing rooms back in England was no longer if they could hit the targets, but if hitting them even mattered. For the Allied bomber crews, a mission ended when the wheels touched the runway. But on the ground in France, in the mangled forests and cratered fields of the Pas de Calais, the end of a raid was merely the beginning of the work. As the last drone of the bombers faded towards the Channel, a different kind of army would emerge. These were the men of the organization TOT, the vast civil and military engineering corps of the Third Reich. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they were fighting a crucial battle in the Crossbow War, a battle of concrete and camouflage, of deception and sheer bloody-minded persistence. They were the magicians of this new war, tasked with making the instruments of death disappear into the landscape. What the Allied planners soon discovered was that they were not just fighting an enemy, they were fighting a ghost. The Germans, understanding that their static launch sites were terribly vulnerable to the Allied air machine, had become masters of illusion. Camouflage was not an afterthought, it was an art form, an integral part of the site's design. A ski site would be tucked into a dense wood, with only the bare minimum of trees cleared to allow for a launch. The long assembly buildings were painted to resemble large French farmhouses, complete with fake windows and painted-on shadows to deceive the cameras 5 miles above. Camouflage nets, woven with foliage that was changed with the seasons, would be draped over concrete structures, making them indistinguishable from the surrounding countryside. From the all-seeing eye of a reconnaissance Spitfire, a deadly weapon of terror looked for all the world like a peaceful, bucolic scene. The deception went deeper. For every real launch site, the Germans built several fakes. These were crude but brilliantly effective dummies, crafted from logs, canvas, and telephone poles. From the grainy, high-altitude perspective of a PRU camera, these decoy sites looked genuine enough to warrant an attack. For the German command, it was a simple, brutal calculation. Every 1,000-pound bomb wasted on a field of worthless logs was a small, quiet victory in a war of attrition. A bomb that did not fall on a real target where men were working. The strategy worked. Allied post-raid photographs would often show these decoy sites utterly obliterated, a testament to the accuracy of the bombing, but a complete waste of aircraft, fuel, and the lives of the crews. Even when the bombers did strike true, the effect was often frustratingly temporary. The moment a raid concluded, the repair crews would swarm over the damage. They worked with astonishing speed and efficiency, clearing rubble, pouring new concrete from pre-positioned mixers, and replacing damaged sections of the launch ramps with prefabricated parts. The result was a maddening, cyclical ballet of destruction and renewal. A PRU Spitfire would photograph a damaged site on Tuesday, The heavies would return to finish the job on Wednesday. And by Friday, a new reconnaissance photo would show the repair crews already at work, the ramp relayed, the damage seemingly erased. Back at Medmenham, the analysts staring at the photos felt a growing sense of unease. They were playing a shell game against a master illusionist. For every site they found and destroyed, 2 more seemed to appear on the maps. Germany was not just building weapons, it was buying time. And the clock, which had been ticking loudly in London, now seemed to be accelerating. The ski sites were a problem of quantity, a frustrating network of small, dispersed targets. But the new structures that began to emerge on the reconnaissance photos in late 1943 were a problem of an entirely different magnitude. They were a problem of quality, of sheer brute force engineering that defied belief. Near the French town of Epernay, and later at Wizernes and other locations, the Germans were building fortresses. These were not mere launch pads, they were colossal, semi-subterranean V-weapon factories and launch bunkers, man-made mountains of steel-reinforced concrete with walls and roofs many meters thick. Post-raid photos from conventional bombing runs were a study in futility, showing the immense concrete carapaces pockmarked with black smudges, like a child had thrown pebbles at a battleship. The 1,000-pound bombs of the B-17s and Lancasters simply bounced off, detonating harmlessly. Allied command faced a horrifying prospect. If these concrete monsters became operational, they could unleash a torrent of V-weapons that no amount of bombing on the smaller sites could prevent. The problem was handed to a man who did not think in terms of conventional explosions, but in terms of physics.
Barnes Wallis, the quiet, brilliant, and sometimes eccentric engineer at Vickers Armstrongs, had already achieved legendary status as the inventor of the bouncing bomb that had shattered the Ruhr dams. He understood that trying to punch through 16 feet of solid, steel-laced concrete with a bigger bomb was a fool's errand. His solution was characteristically radical. He theorized that you didn't have to break through the roof if you could destroy the foundation. He envisioned a weapon that would not explode on impact, but would be designed for one purpose: to penetrate deep into the earth beside the target before detonating. The resulting explosion would create a massive cavern, a void into which the structure's foundations would collapse. It was, in effect, a man-made earthquake. From this theory, the Tallboy was born. It was a masterpiece of lethal design, weighing a colossal 12,000 pounds. It was exquisitely aerodynamic, with a long, pointed nose and fins canted to impart a stabilizing spin, allowing it to reach supersonic speed during its final plunge. Its casing was made of immensely strong, high-tensile steel, enabling it to survive the colossal impact with the ground. This was no ordinary bomb. It was a bunker-killing projectile of unprecedented power. But such a weapon needed a special kind of delivery service. The only aircraft in the RAF capable of carrying it was the Avro Lancaster, and even it had to be specially modified, its bomb bay doors removed entirely to accommodate the giant. The task was given to the only unit with the proven skill for such high-stakes precision work, the legendary 617th Squadron, the Dambusters. In June 1944, the Dambusters flew their first Tallboy mission against a railway tunnel, proving the concept worked. Then, they turned their attention to the V-weapon sites. The attack on the Epernay bunker was a showcase of this new warfare. From the cockpit of the modified Lancaster, the bomb's release was less a drop and more an unburdening, the aircraft leaping upwards as the 6-ton weapon fell away. There was no satisfying fiery blossom on the surface. Instead, the ground itself seemed to flinch. A deep subterranean tremor shuddered through the air. A dull thump felt more in the bones than heard with the ears, followed moments later by a vast upheaval of earth and smoke. The earthquake bomb had done its job. The concrete monster, which had shrugged off hundreds of conventional bombs, was grievously wounded, its foundations cracked, its structure compromised. Wallis had forged a key. The elite airmen of 617 Squadron had proven it could turn the lock. The concrete monsters could be slain. Hope arrived on June 6, 1944, on the beaches of Normandy. Terror arrived exactly 1 week later in the form of a strange, sputtering noise in the skies over southeast England. For months, Operation Crossbow had been a desperate, secret war fought by spies, analysts, and airmen to prevent this very moment. For all the bombs dropped, for all the sites cratered, the race had been lost. The monster was out of its cage. In the early morning hours of June 13th, the first V-1 flying bomb crossed the Channel and slammed into a railway bridge in London. And with that explosion, the nature of the war changed once again. The front line was no longer in France. It was in the back gardens of Kent and the suburbs of London. It was not the familiar, deep-throated drone of a bomber formation that announced this new enemy. This was a ragged, angry, pulsing roar, the sound of an infernal two-stroke engine that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. It was a crude, mechanical, and deeply impersonal sound. Londoners, with their characteristic gallows humor, would soon give it a name that was both whimsical and terrifying: the Doodlebug, or the Buzz Bomb. It was a weapon that turned the entire city into a lottery. There were no specific targets, no military objectives. Its only goal was to fall somewhere, anywhere, and spread panic and chaos. It was a mindless, unguided projectile, an instrument of pure spite aimed at the civilian population as payback for the Normandy landings. But the true terror of the Doodlebug was not the noise, it was the silence. The moment the sputtering engine cut out, a profound and dreadful quiet would fall over a whole section of the city. In that heart-stopping pause, lasting anywhere from 5 to 12 seconds, life itself seemed to hold its breath. Pedestrians would freeze on the pavement, mothers would grab their children, faces would turn upwards to an empty sky, listening. That silence was the sound of a 1-ton bomb tipping into its terminal dive. It was a uniquely cruel piece of psychological torture. You could hear your fate approaching, but the silence meant you no longer knew where it was going. The horrendous, ground-shattering explosion that inevitably followed was almost a relief from the unbearable tension of that quiet. Life in London transformed into a new, nerve-shredding routine. People developed an almost animal instinct for the sound, able to distinguish the Doodlebug's ragged pulse from the smooth hum of a friendly aircraft. Children were evacuated from the city once again, a painful echo of the Blitz. People took to sleeping in cramped Anderson shelters or in the London Underground, their nights punctuated by the sputtering roar and the sudden concussive blasts. Operation Crossbow, for all its bombs and bravery, had failed in its primary mission: to stop the attacks before they could begin. The hunt in France would continue with even greater ferocity, but a new, desperate battle was now being fought. A last-ditch defense in the skies over their own homes. The reign of terror had begun. The terror raining down on London demanded an answer, not in a week or a day, but now. As the first Doodlebug scarred the capital, a furious, desperate, and ultimately brilliant improvisation of defense began to take shape under the command of Air Marshal Roderick Hill. The battle against the V-1 would not just be fought over France. A new, violent front line was drawn in the skies over the home counties of England itself. It would be a defense in depth, a 3-layered gauntlet of fighters, guns, and balloons designed to bleed the flying bomb offensive dry before it could reach the city. The first line of defense belonged to the pilots. The air defense of Great Britain threw its fastest fighters into the fray. The powerful Hawker Tempests, the high-performance Spitfires 14s, and even the first squadron of Gloucester Meteor jets rushed into service to hunt this new prey. The task was brutally difficult. The Doodlebug was a small target, moving at a relentless 400 miles per hour. Initially, shooting one down was perilous. The massive explosion of the warhead could easily destroy the attacking aircraft. This danger led to the development of a maneuver of breathtaking audacity and skill.
A pilot would skillfully draw his fighter alongside the sputtering bomb, flying wingtip to wingtip with the mindless machine. Then, he would gently slide his own wing under the Doodlebug's stubby wing and give a slight, firm lift. The disrupted airflow was enough to topple the V-1's primitive gyroscope, sending it tumbling out of control to explode harmlessly in a field below. It was an aerial form of martial arts, an act of supreme confidence and finesse in the heat of battle. The second and most formidable line of defense was the guns. Initially, the anti-aircraft batteries ringing London were struggling, but General Frederick Pyle, the commander of Anti-Aircraft Command, made a radical and decisive gamble. In a monumental feat of logistics, codenamed Operation Diver, he ripped his entire defensive network out of the London suburbs and moved it, in a matter of days, to the coast. He created a massive, dense gun belt along the cliffs of Kent and Sussex, a flaming hedge that every V-1 would have to cross. This move was combined with a revolutionary piece of American technology, the proximity fuse. This tiny radio transmitter and receiver in the nose of an anti-aircraft shell was a game-changer. It automatically detonated the shell when it sensed it was close to a target. A near miss was now as good as a direct hit. The effect was immediate and devastating. The coastal belt became a wall of fire, a churning, explosive curtain of radar-guided, proximity-fused shells that tore the Doodlebugs from the sky in droves. The final, last-ditch line of defense was the silent sentinels, the barrage balloons. A curtain of thousands of these gas-filled behemoths was raised around the capital, their thick steel cables creating a deadly web for any low-flying V-1s that had managed to get through the fighters and the guns. Fighter, gun, and balloon, a three-layered shield had been forged in the heat of battle, a testament to British ingenuity and resolve. The defenders of London were learning, adapting, and fighting back. They were winning the battle against the Doodlebug, but they were fighting the noisy war. They had no defense and no answer for the silent one they did not yet know was coming.
By September of 1944, a fragile, weary confidence had returned to London. The drone of the Doodlebug, thanks to the heroic efforts of the defenders, was becoming a rarer sound. The great shield of fighters, guns, and balloons had held. Londoners, while still living amidst the rubble of a long war, began to believe the worst of the flying bomb menace was over. They were catastrophically wrong. At 6:43 p.m. on September 8th, on a quiet residential street in Chiswick, a three-story house simply vanished. One moment it was there, a typical brick home glinting in the late summer sun. The next, it was a 30-foot crater of raw earth and splintered debris. There had been no siren, no engine, no warning, just a sudden, violent erasure from existence. In Whitehall, the initial reports were met with confusion. The first official theory was a massive gas main explosion. But then another unexplained blast occurred in Essex, and another. The truth, which intelligence had long feared, was now undeniable. The big rocket, the weapon codenamed A4, had arrived. This was the V2, and it brought with it a new and far more profound kind of terror. The Doodlebug had been frightening because of its sound. The V2 was terrifying because of its silence. It traveled at more than 3 times the speed of sound, plunging from the edge of space to its target faster than a rifle bullet. It announced itself only with its own cataclysmic impact. For those on the ground, it created a deeply unsettling inversion of physics and instinct. First, the ground-shaking crump of the 1-ton warhead exploding. Then, seconds later, a second thunderous roar would roll across the sky, the sound of the rocket's atmospheric passage arriving long after the destruction it had caused. It was the sound of the impossible, a noise chasing its own effect, the thunder after a lightning strike that was never seen. This was a weapon against which there was no defense. The fighters that hunted the Doodlebug were useless. The coastal gun belt that had been a roaring success was now silent and irrelevant. The barrage balloons floated impotently. There was nothing in the Allied arsenal that could stop an object falling at 2,000 miles per hour. The psychological impact was devastating. The V-1 attacks, for all their horror, had a communal element. People could take shelter, they could listen for the engine, they could cheer when they heard one shot down. The V-2 was a solitary, fatalistic terror. It bred a new kind of dread, a feeling of utter helplessness. A bolt from a clear blue sky could obliterate you at any second, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about it. The government, fearing mass panic, initially censored the news, continuing to blame the explosions on faulty gas mains. But the truth could not be contained. The silent killer was stalking the city, and the air raid sirens no longer sounded for it. There was simply no point. For the people of London, all that was left was a grim hope that the Allied armies fighting their way across Europe could advance faster than the rockets could fall. The arrival of the V-2 rendered the old maps obsolete. In the Allied command centers, the entire strategy of Operation Crossbow had to be torn up and rewritten overnight. The hunt for static, concrete monsters was over. The Tallboy bombs that could shatter a bunker were useless against an enemy that refused to sit still. A new, far more difficult hunt had begun: the hunt for a ghost. The German engineers, in a stroke of adaptive genius, had largely abandoned the idea of launching from fixed fortresses. The V-2 did not need a fortress. It needed a firm piece of ground, a clearing in a forest near The Hague, and a highly skilled crew of technicians who could appear, launch a 14-ton missile, and vanish in under 6 hours. They were phantoms. Their only signature, the sudden, fiery plume of a launch and the deafening roar that sent a shockwave across the Dutch countryside. By the time a reconnaissance plane could photograph the scorch mark on the ground, the launch convoy was gone, swallowed by the local road network. This new reality forced a paradigm shift in Allied thinking. The new strategy was one of strangulation. If you couldn't kill the beast in its lair, you would starve it to death by cutting off its food supply. The target was no longer a single building, but the entire circulatory system that allowed the V-2 to function. Operation Crossbow's focus pivoted from sight-busting to interdiction. Allied bomber and fighter bomber squadrons were given a new target list. They went after railway lines, bridges, road junctions, and marshalling yards across the Netherlands and Western Germany. It was a campaign against geography itself, an attempt to create so much friction and chaos in the German logistics network that the rockets simply couldn't get to their launch points. The intelligence challenge was immense. The unblinking eye of the reconnaissance plane, so vital in finding the ski sites, was no longer enough. The most vital intelligence now came from the bravest of the Dutch resistance. These men and women, living under brutal occupation, became the forward observers for Crossbow. They would watch a V-2 convoy, with its distinctive Mielerwagen transporter, rumble past their window and risk everything to tap out a coded message to London, reporting its location and direction. This human intelligence was perilous to acquire, and often arrived too late to act upon directly, but it allowed the Allies to build a pattern, to understand the flow of the V-2 supply chain. This new phase of the hunt was a messy, brutal, and often frustrating business. It was a war of attrition, measured not in sites destroyed, but in hours of delay imposed upon the enemy. Allied fighter bombers like the Typhoon and Thunderbolt would scream down on railway tracks, hoping to sever a line for a few precious days. Medium bombers would attack storage depots and liquid oxygen plants, the vital fuel for the rockets. The rockets continued to fall on London, and now on the critical Allied supply port of Antwerp. But for every damaged rail line and every shattered bridge, a V-2 that might have launched was forced to wait. The Allies were no longer trying to slay the beast with a single blow. They were trying to slowly, painstakingly bleed it to death. The V-weapons had two targets. The first was the physical city of London, a target of brick, steel, and stone. The second, and by far the more important, was the city's spirit, a target of hope, resilience, and resolve. The Germans were brutally effective at hitting the first.
they would fail completely at hitting the second. In the final grim winter of 1944 and into 1945, as the Doodlebugs continued to fall and the silent, shocking blows of the V-2 became a feature of daily life, the German High Command waited for the news they were sure would come, that London was panicking, that its morale was cracking, that the British people were demanding an end to the war. That news never came. What happened instead was a testament to a quality forged in the fire of the Blitz 4 years earlier. It was a resilience born of pure exhaustion and stubbornness. The extraordinary had become mundane. The sudden, violent blast of a V-2 was no longer a moment of pure shock, but a grim punctuation mark in the city's daily rhythm. The brief, terrible silence of a V-1's engine cutting out was a cue for a collective, city-wide tensing of muscles, followed by a quiet sigh of relief if the explosion was distant.
An air raid warden would blow the all clear, and almost immediately the sound of sweeping glass would begin, a sound as familiar as the morning bird song. The city bled, but it did not stop. The underground trains continued to run, the milkmen crunched over broken glass to deliver the morning pints, and the famous Windmill Theater, which had never closed during the Blitz, kept its promise with a sign that defiantly read, "We never closed." They fought back not with guns, but with gallows humor. It was a weapon the Germans could not comprehend and could not counter. A pub with its windows blown out would hang a sign, "More open than usual." Jokes circulated about the randomness of the V-2. "If you hear it, it can't hurt you," was the grimly accurate punchline. This cynical, defiant laughter was a shield, a way of robbing the invisible, impersonal enemy of the satisfaction of their terror. It was a refusal to act like a victim. This was a different kind of courage from the Blitz. Then there were bombers to see, fighters to cheer, a visible battle in the sky. The V-weapons, especially the V-2, offered no such release. It was a cold, lonely, fatalistic threat. The resilience required to face it was quieter, deeper, and perhaps even more profound. In the final analysis, the V-weapon campaign was a profound strategic miscalculation, based on the flawed premise that a free people could be terrified into submission. But years of war had forged the spirit of London into something hard and unyielding. The miracle weapons could shatter buildings, but they could not shatter the will of the people within them. Their refusal to break meant that Church's government never came under popular pressure to divert significant military resources from the main battle in Europe. The front line held. That quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken was London's secret weapon, and it was the one thing the engineers at Peenemünde could never have designed a countermeasure for. For more than a year, the war against the V-weapons had been a long-range duel fought by pilots, scientists, and intelligence analysts. But the final, decisive blow would not be delivered from 5 miles in the air. It would be delivered at ground level by infantrymen slogging through the mud and tankers churning through the hedgerows of France and the Low Countries. The bombers had harassed, the fighters had defended, and the guns had thrown up a wall of fire. But it was the inexorable advance of the Allied armies after D-Day that would ultimately prove to be the only truly effective countermeasure. The ultimate weapon against the rocket was the riflemen. As the British and Canadian armies pushed out from the Normandy beachhead and swept north into the Pas de Calais, they began to physically overrun the heartland of the V-1 launch sites. For a soldier advancing through the French countryside, stumbling upon a captured ski site was a surreal experience. They had lived under the threat of these things, heard the worried stories and letters from home. Now they stood beside the strange, silent ramps, walking through the wreckage of buildings that had been pummeled into concrete dust by their own air forces. The ground was a lunar landscape of overlapping bomb craters. It was the physical manifestation of a victory, a sign that every mile they marched forward made their families a mile safer. By September 1944, the vast majority of the fixed V-1 sites had been captured, and the Doodlebug threat to London was largely, though not entirely, eliminated. The V-2 was a different problem. The mobile launch units, the ghosts of the Dutch forests, simply retreated with the German army, constantly setting up their launch sites just behind the front lines. But the Allied advance was a shrinking box. As the armies pushed into the Netherlands, the available launch areas from which a rocket could still reach London became fewer and fewer. The hunters were becoming the hunted. Pushed out of range of London, the Germans turned their remaining V-2s on a new, crucial military target, the recently liberated port of Antwerp. Through the winter of 1944, Antwerp became the most heavily bombarded city of the V-2 campaign, a desperate attempt by the Germans to disrupt the primary Allied supply hub. But the end was inevitable. It did not come with a single dramatic explosion in the sky. It came with the quiet, inexorable advance of a line on a map. As Canadian and British divisions cleared the Scheldt estuary and pushed deeper into Holland, they were doing more than just liberating territory. They were systematically unplugging the V-weapon machine. Every captured crossroads, every secured patch of forest was one less place from which a rocket could be fired. The final V-2 launched against England fell in late March 1945. Shortly thereafter, the Allied ground forces overran the last operational launch areas. The terror from the sky was finally and definitively ended by the force on the ground. The duel was over. In the final accounting of the Second World War, the German V-weapon program stands as one of history's greatest paradoxes, a stunning, almost science-fictional technological achievement that was, at the same time, a catastrophic strategic failure. The V-2 in particular, a weapon that could touch the edge of space in 1944, was a triumph of engineering that had almost no positive impact on Germany's war effort. In fact, a strong case can be made that the immense investment into this miracle weapon ultimately hastened the Third Reich's defeat. It was a weapon that succeeded brilliantly in its technical goals while failing completely in its strategic ones. The numbers, when examined after the war, told a story of profoundly misplaced priorities. The program was a black hole for resources at a time when Germany could afford them least. The steel required to build a single V-2 rocket could have produced 24 of the formidable Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The thousands of brilliant engineers and technicians at Peenemünde, the most advanced scientific minds in the nation, were dedicated to a weapon that attacked civilian morale, while other, more practical military projects were starved for their expertise. The German war machine was desperate for jet fighters like the Me-262, which could have challenged Allied air supremacy, and for advanced U-boats to cripple the supply lines from America. The V program consumed the skilled labor, the rare alloys, and the advanced electronics that could have brought these battlefield-changing weapons into service in decisive numbers. No one understood this better than the man who had to sign the orders for the raw materials, Albert Speer. Germany's Minister of Armaments, in his post-war memoirs, was unequivocal, calling the entire rocket program a colossal mistake. He argued that the resources poured into the V-2 could have produced a vast fleet of jet fighters that might have swept the Allied bombers from the skies over Germany, potentially prolonging the war significantly. From his pragmatic perspective, the rocket was an expensive, theatrical indulgence with no real military payoff. It was a weapon of terror, but by late 1944, the Allies were not going to be terrified into submission. This was the core of the paradox, the timing. Had the V-weapons been ready in 1942 or even 1943, before the D-Day landings, and when the Allied bombing campaign was still ramping up, they might have had a profound, war-altering effect. But they arrived too late. They were a weapon for a war Germany was no longer in a position to win. They were fired in anger and desperation after the strategic outcome of the war had already been decided. The rocket that could reach the stars had almost no impact on the war on the ground. Its true, ironic legacy was not the terror it spread over London, but the void it created in Germany's own arsenal. In its obsessive quest for a miracle weapon to punish its enemies, the Third Reich had inadvertently inflicted a grievous, self-inflicted wound. As the last shots of the Second World War echoed across a shattered Europe, a new, quieter conflict began. It was a clandestine war fought by intelligence agents and technical teams, a frantic race not for territory but for the ultimate spoils of victory, the technology of the V-2 rocket and, more importantly, the minds of the men who had created it. As the Allied and Soviet armies converged on the heart of Germany, they were not just liberating a nation, they were picking through the scientific bones of the most technologically advanced weapons program on Earth. The war was over, but the hunt was not. Deep in the Harz Mountains, American soldiers uncovered the Mittelwerk, the vast subterranean factory where the V-2s had been mass-produced. What they found was a vision of both technological heaven and human hell. Inside the mountain, they discovered a futuristic assembly line with scores of V-2s in various stages of completion. Just outside the tunnels, they found the corresponding nightmare, the remnants of the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp, where tens of thousands of slave laborers had been worked to oblivion to build Hitler's miracle weapon. It was a stark, horrifying reminder of the human cost of the rocket's engineering. But the rockets themselves were useless without the instruction manual. The real prize was the team of scientists from Peenemünde. For Wernher von Braun and his top engineers, the end of the war was not a moment of defeat, but a moment of decision. He was a man possessed by a single, all-consuming dream: spaceflight. The V-2 for him had always been a stepping stone to the stars. Looking at the map of a collapsing Germany, he saw not front lines, but potential patrons for that dream. He deliberately led his team of hundreds of top scientists south, away from the advancing Soviets, and into the path of the Americans, whom he correctly surmised had the resources and the ambition to fund the next stage of his work. In early May 1945, von Braun's brother, Magnus, rode a bicycle down a Bavarian country lane, flagged down a startled American GI, and announced that the inventor of the V-2 wished to surrender. What followed was Operation Paperclip, a top-secret American program to secure this German intellectual property. It was a Faustian bargain, struck in the nascent chill of the Cold War. The architects of a Nazi terror weapon, many of whom were dedicated party members, were to be given new lives and new laboratories in America. Their pasts would be scrubbed, their wartime roles minimized, all in the name of gaining a strategic advantage over the new adversary, the Soviet Union. While the Americans secured von Braun and his inner circle, the Soviets were conducting their own parallel hunt. They captured the ruins of Peenemünde and parts of the Nordhausen factory, along with hundreds of lower-level technicians and engineers. They too had acquired enough pieces of the puzzle to begin their own formidable rocket program. The V-2 was dead. Long live the V-2! The weapon of vengeance, born in the secret labs of the Third Reich, was about to be reincarnated, its terrifying power now in the hands of the two new superpowers who would shape the history of the 20th century. The last V-2 fell on England in March of 1945, but the echo of its supersonic passage would reverberate for the rest of the century and beyond. The weapon itself was defeated, but the knowledge it represented had been unleashed upon the world. The fiery plume that rose from the forests of Holland would be seen again, rising from the deserts of New Mexico and the steppes of Kazakhstan, heralding the dawn of a new and profoundly dangerous age. The spoils of war from Germany's rocket program would not just be studied, they would be perfected, multiplied, and become the defining technology of the post-war era. This was the ultimate, dual-edged legacy of the V-weapon. The V-2, a weapon of terror, became the direct ancestor of the Cold War's arsenals. In the United States, Wernher von Braun and his team of paperclip scientists essentially rebuilt and improved upon their creation for the U.S. Army, developing the Redstone missile, a direct descendant of the V-2. In the Soviet Union, engineers under the brilliant leadership of Sergei Korolev used their captured V-2s and German technicians as a technological university, reverse engineering the design to build their own powerful rockets.
This direct lineage, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, would culminate in the intercontinental ballistic missiles that held the world in a state of suspended nuclear terror for 50 years. The vengeance weapon designed to destroy a single city had given mankind the power to destroy civilization itself.
Yet this is only half of the story, the dark side of the V2's legacy. For the very same machine of war also contained the promise of humanity's oldest dream. The rocket that could carry a 1-ton warhead could also carry a scientific instrument, a satellite, or even a human being beyond the confines of Earth's gravity. The sword of vengeance was about to be beaten into the plowshare of exploration. The Soviet R-7 rocket, the world's first ICBM, was the very same rocket that shocked the world by launching Sputnik into orbit and later Yuri Gagarin into the cosmos. No one embodied this stunning paradox more than Wernher von Braun. The man whose genius had been dedicated to raining random destruction on London would, a quarter of a century later, stand in the firing room at Cape Canaveral and watch his masterpiece, the Saturn V, a machine whose fundamental principles were born at Peenemünde, carry the first men to the moon. It was one of history's most profound and unsettling ironies. The architect of the ultimate terror weapon became the architect of humanity's greatest journey of exploration. Operation Crossbow was, in the end, more than just a military campaign. It was the world's violent introduction to the rocket age. The V-weapon, which failed so completely to change the outcome of the Second World War, would go on to define the world that followed it. Its echoes are with us still, in the silent, watchful orbits of thousands of satellites, and in the coiled potential of the missile silos that still dot the globe. The hunt for the vengeance weapons was over, but the age they had created had only just begun.